It's so unique and unforgettable and beautiful. It's always been one of the greatest sights in the whole of Britain. In the Middle Ages, they used to refer to it in Latin as unum mirabilium occidentalium, one of the miracles of the West.
We always looked at it as an island, and we thoroughly enjoyed ourselves when we were younger, when the tide was in and we were cut off from the mainland, because you sort of felt you were free. But of course, when one got older, you would rather see the tide out so that you could contact the mainland.
It was a very good life, a marvellous life for children. No traffic, no nothing. The only thing they had to do was fall overboard. And most of them did that, you know, and saved themselves or were pulled out. That was a known thing, overboard. And the living was very, very good. You had to be a good wife. And it was better for the men, I always think. It wasn't a wife's island, as you might say. But you had to have a big store cupboard all the time, and you had to be a good hand at making and doing. It was really wonderful. I wouldn't have missed living on the Mount for anything.
St. Michael's Mount, a large granite rock about a mile in circumference, surmounted by a church and fortress, the top of the church tower standing 238 feet above low water. For 16 hours a day, the mount is an island. As the tide recedes, the half-mile-long stone causeway reaches across to the nearest point on the mainland and the market town of Marazion. The Domesday Survey of 1086 shows that in the reign of Edward the Confessor, the mount was already under the patronage of St. Michael, but as Dr A. Rouse told me, it was quite probably occupied long before that.
It really goes right back as a sacred spot, I suspect, to prehistoric times. You know, the old Cornish name for it was the grey rock in the wood, Carreg Lws en Cws, and that shows you that the land must have surrounded it at one time, and I've always heard that the old fishermen occasionally find in the very shallow waters around it trunks of trees and so on. The water, of course, has receded it, leaving it on half an island only. When the tide is low, you walk across the causeway. The result of this is that it must have been occupied from prehistoric times. I believe at the foot of the mount they once made a Bronze Age find of spearheads and shields and weapons of that sort. I haven't much doubt myself that it is the place that is known to the Roman geographers as Ictis, because Cornwall was the greatest source of tin in prehistoric times, and really throughout the whole of history, right up until yesterday, until last century. And they have found ingots of tin and so forth. That would have been the place from which it would have been shipped. And I'll tell you why. You know, the Mount was the only harbour in that part of Cornwall. The rest was an open roadstead. There wasn't a harbour at Penzance, but a harbour was made at the Mount in the early Middle Ages by the monks who were there, and also aided by the secular people.
And of course Marazion had been there and had built up and had developed around the Mount, hadn't it?
Yes, as the opposite end, so to say, you know, at the other end of the causeway. I think that in considering the history of the Mount, we ought really to divide it into two. The church part, the religious part, and then the secular part of it. High places in Europe were very often dedicated to St. Michael. The same is true, you know, St. Michael's Chapel on Roughtor, and also a chapel on the top of Rame Head It's because St. Michael is supposed to have appeared himself on a couple of very important hill sites, and the most important to us is Mont Saint-Michel, which is just opposite to us on the coast of Normandy, practically in Brittany. And in course of time, our St. Michael's Mount became a dependency, a cell of Mont Saint-Michel after the Norman conquest. Before that, it would, I think, have had some Celtic monks there, because Edward the Confessor is said to have given a charter, and at the time of the Norman conquest there was a priest in charge there called Brismar. Well, we don't want to go back too far, but when you have the Norman conquest, and Normandy and England were really part of the same kingdom, it was quite natural in a way that our St. Michael's Mount should really be made to depend on the very much bigger abbey of Mont Saint-Michel. I personally think that our St. Michael's Mount is rather more beautiful. I tell you why. There's a huge great abbey built on Mont Saint-Michel with a regular town at the foot, and it rather sort of superincomes upon the island. Whereas when you look at St. Michael's Mount, from whichever angle you look at it, it's incredibly beautiful and picturesque. The buildings on the top of it are not really too big for the rock and the island, are they? Everything is in proportion. Well then, during the whole of the Middle Ages, it was a kind of holy place, and it was usually inhabited by 3 monks. In the end, it became established that one of them was called an archpriest, and then there were 2 chaplains. But you would have had secular people also as servants of the monks, and a bailiff who would be there to collect all the tithes, because the monks lived off the tithes on the fish. And of course fishing has been the leading industry, so to speak, all round the Mount all through the ages, and the fishermen have been very important features of the landscape. We mustn't forget them. But there was also a very important service that the monks performed in addition to their prayers. They kept the beacon light going, which helped ships, you see, at sea. I don't suppose it was a very strong light, but the beacon was there on top of the tower.
It was the monks as well that laid that causeway across to the mount, wasn't it?
Oh, it was all done during their time. Then, the most important thing of all was their making of a breakwater and the harbour. In the Middle Ages, I mean, talk about modern tourism, all through the Middle Ages there were pilgrimages to St. Michael's Mount. The pilgrims wended their way up that rocky path, and there they knelt before the image of St. Michael and left their offerings in the church there. It was easier than going all the way to Jerusalem or going to Santiago de Compostela. There's a very important Cornish ecclesiastic called Michael Tregury. I suppose he must have come from a place called Tregurion, and he was Archbishop of Dublin. Well, he couldn't get to St. Michael's Mount, so I have found in his will that he left money for somebody else to perform the pilgrimage for him. I mean, money will usually make anything permissible, Ted, won't it? The point, you see, that I'm making is that it's always been a great sort of centre for tourism, though in the Middle Ages you called that pilgrimage.
Well, tourists, as we know, and even pilgrims still visit St. Michael's Mount today. In the Middle Ages, visitors had to wait for the tide to go out, and pilgrims would gather together at the chapel of St. Catherine that stood on the green stone rock on the sands between the Mount and Marazion at the end of the causeway. This site is still known as Chapel Rock, although the chapel itself was pulled down during the Civil War in 1645. Halfway across, on the left, you can still see a square stone which has a socket drilled into it. In this stood a cross at the time when the mount was principally a place of Christian worship. Today, that stone serves as a warning to those making their way across on foot. If it's just covered by the incoming tide, you'll be waist-deep in water by the time you'd reach that point on the causeway. Something that Colonel John St Aubyn didn't notice one night in 1684. He tried to cross on horseback, but was drowned in the attempt. When I visited St. Michael's Mount, Lord St Levan took me to the top of the castle. Well, we've now come out, yes, onto the open terracing here at St. Michael's Mount, and There's a real splendid panoramic view here in front of us. Over to the left we've got Penzance, and then we can see Eastern Green in the background there, the hills beyond looking across towards St.Ives, and there nestling just across at the other end of the causeway itself is Marazion. And the causeway now is covered completely by water. We're isolated from the mainland. Now, this terrace, has this always been here?
In the old days, in the old prints, it shows there was a little terrace here. And then when they put the modern kitchens, they built the kitchens underneath this. We also think this was the burial ground. You can see here there's a tombstone of one of the priors of St Michael's Mount. You can see the human figure and the Christian cross. I think that's 13th century. King Henry VIII's librarian called John Leland came here, and he describes this as he saw it then. And he said that on the right is the lodgings of the monks. That's obviously where their dormitory was. And then he said there was St Michael's Chapel, which you can see facing you. And on the left was the Lady Chapel. So this was described in the reign of King Henry VIII exactly as you're looking at it now. You know the story of St Michael's Tower, that if anybody gets married in the chapel of St Michael's Mount, the bride and the bridegroom have to race each other to the top of the tower, and the first person to sit in St Michael's Tower rules the household for the rest of their life. But if you'd committed some grievous sin, you had to sit on St Michael's Tower, and the original St Michael's Tower was the cliff on the right. And then I think the monks decided that was too easy, and they made the pilgrims sit in the chair on the top of the tower.
This is the penance that you had to pay.
This is the penance you had to pay.
Were there many relics here on the mount? Relics of St Michael? Or?
Yes, they were all taken away by King Henry VIII at the time of the Reformation, but we have inventories of when St Michael's Mount was taken away from the French St Michael's Mount in 1425 and given to Zion Abbey. We know exactly what was in the chapel at the time, and they had the relics of the True Cross. A rather interesting relic was the jawbone of St Apollonia, who was a young girl who had all her teeth pulled out one by one when she was martyred, and of course she's the patron saint of dentists now. Well, that meant that probably when the pilgrims came here, they came here to be cured of toothache, for other reasons.
Isn't there also a story that Joseph of Arimathea came here with the boy Christ?
Yes, that is a story that's told. We don't claim that as a necessarily a true legend, but it would be very nice if it was true. And it's known that Joseph of Arimathea was in the tin trade, and it's extremely possible that Christ was brought here when he was 12 years old. We shall never know, but it's possible.
Do you have services here regularly?
Yes, we have a church service every Sunday in the summer. We can't have church services in the winter always because of the tide being in and the weather. We also have pilgrimages who come here, particularly pilgrimages of people who want to invoke St Michael.
So it isn't just purely tourism today. The church and St Michael's Mount itself is still serving that original purpose.
It certainly is, and we get letters from people who come here on a pilgrimage, and it's been a great spiritual event in their lives and meant a great deal to them.
Well, now we're walking through, and we're actually in the church here on the top of St Michael's Mount itself.
This is the original monastery chapel. The chapel was built by Bernard de Bec, the abbot of Mont Saint-Michel, in 1135. And then, of all things, there was an earthquake here in 1275, and a lot of the old building was destroyed. You can see some of the old building, particularly by the door, and it was rebuilt in the 14th century. So what you're looking at is a 14th century chapel, restored, of course, later, with a 15th century roof.
Where would the relics have been? Is there any trace of knowing where?
Yes, we do know exactly what the church looked like before the Protestant Reformation. There had been a high altar in the middle, and there had been an altar to St Michael on the right-hand side, and an altar to the crucified Saviour on the left-hand side, and they had various relics. The vision of St Michael, which is, according to the Cornish legend, was 495 AD, when St Michael appeared on the cliff on the western side to fishermen at night. He appeared suffused in light on the cliff. If you went to confess your sins, you might be ordered by your father confessor to come on a pilgrimage to St Michael's Mount. And so that they came here and they were absolved from their sins. And then there wasn't room to have a party after that in the monastery. You can see the buildings were rather restricted in those days, but in the very old prints you can see where the banqueting hall was in the bottom of the island.
So having actually had their sins forgiven, they used to go to the bottom of the mount then and really have a knees up.
Have a knees up, that's right. Yeah. And then they had a long way back to go home, probably.
Yes, they had to reverse their tracks, of course, to get home again. Wasn't there a dungeon or something here in the church where a big skeleton, a giant almost, was found?
Yes, you can see it here on the right-hand side. You can sit in the family pews and not know that underneath your seat there's a door, and you can walk down some steps into a dungeon. When they were building the platform for the altar here about 150 years ago, the workmen discovered the dungeon, and they found a skeleton about 7.5 feet tall in the dungeon, and nobody knows who he was or why he was put there. Sir John Arundel, who attacked the mines in the Civil War, was a very tall man, but nobody knows who he was for certain. It may be a punishment cell, because the French St. Michael's mines, when the monks didn't behave well or disobeyed the abbot, they were put in a dungeon underneath the church. It was thought good for them to be able to hear the church services while they were imprisoned. You see, they had to climb those very narrow stairs up to the top of the tower during the night to light the beacon to guide in the fishing boats. And the monks were very keen that the fishing boats got in safely, because they had a tithe or 1/10 of the profits. And I suppose that if you overslept and you didn't keep the beacon alight, you probably were put in the dungeon.
Now, the Order of St. John has very important connections here with the church.
Yes, this church was dedicated for the Order of St. John by His Royal Highness the Duke of Gloucester in 1977. I think this is probably the only chapel outside Clerkenwell where an investiture can be held, and every year the Lord Lieutenant comes to the chapel and we have a church service, and members of the Order of St. John are invested by the Lord Lieutenant. The reason for that is this lovely early 15th century alabaster head of St. John the Baptist, which you can see in the center above the altar. You can see the head of St. John the Baptist in a plate with the Trinity above him and the bishop below him. And one of the reasons why I was so pleased that the Order of St. John was connected with this chapel was that if at some time in the future my heirs and successors weren't religious, that we know that St. John would be responsible for church services here. Of course, the National Trust is a charity, but it's not one of its charitable purposes to be responsible for religion. So I couldn't rely on the National Trust, and I rely on St. John's Ambulance Brigade to make quite sure that religious worship has gone here over 1,000 years. I hope will continue for the next 1,000 years.
One of the popes in the Middle Ages exempted St. Michael's Mount from the jurisdiction of the bishop. That would have been the Bishop of Exeter in those days. So today, the Bishop of Truro has no control over what sort of church services are held there. Every 5 years, a complete survey is made of the castle, and in the past, this task was carried out by Geoffrey DREWETT, who was consultant architect to the National Trust in Cornwall for 25 years.
Well, of course, with this particular building, it's like a lighthouse. It's built on the top of a rock, and the principal difficulty is keeping it wind and watertight. It is draped over the top of a pyramid formation of rock. At the highest point, you'll get the chapel, and then the rest of the building drapes down the sides. The stone walls are all built with what we call moor stone, which is granite taken from near the surface, and which is to a certain extent porous and has a vein in it which leads water in. And on an exposed place like this, particularly on the southwest side, it does drive water through it and makes for damp inside. Although the walls are, say, 4 foot 6 to even 8 feet thick, you still get some damp on the inside. And then, of course, the next phase was when Piers St. Aubyn, the architect, added the whole of the Victorian wing of the castle, which is the east end between the chapel and the Chivy Chase room. The stone that he used was quarried stone from further deeper in the ground and is much more impervious to water, and therefore we don't have so much trouble with damp here, although even now when we want to repoint the building, for instance, it is a considerable job to get scaffold on the south side, and quite a dangerous job. In those days, the scaffold they would have used, of course, would have been all wood scaffold in barrels and roped together, and it was probably done by ship's carpenters or riggers, and they were probably just as skilled as the present-day scaffolders. But they certainly had the same problem as we've got now, which is that everything has to be taken across at low water and then brought up to the top of the hill and then manhandled to wherever the scaffold is needed. It must have been a great undertaking then, and it still is, to get any of the difficult pieces of it. And of course, increase the cost of any maintenance work that's done on the stonework. But we are lucky in that there have been various descriptions of the mount at different times by historians. For instance, the one by Bolace gives a description of what the mount was like in about 1750. In particular, he was explaining the nunnery, which was the Lady Chapel, and which then became the two blue drawing rooms on the very east end of the chapel, and explains that what is now called the Chivy Chase room was the refectory, and that the kitchens were on the west side, which is known as Sir John's study, and where the armoury is was the coal cellar and the larder and the pantry, etc. So it gave a very realistic description of the use of the building at that time. And it was generally an adaptation of what had been used for the monastery, which became then used as a garrison and a monastery. And then the monastery faded out, and then the garrison faded out, and all those rooms were taken over as the living accommodation for the St Aubyn family and the people who lived in the castle.
The Cornish historian Richard Carew, in his survey of Cornwall, published in 1602, reveals other interesting facts about St Michael's Mount.
He tells us quite a bit about the history. Shortly after the discomfiture of Henry VI, in the reign of Edward IV, 1473, John, Earl of Oxford, one of the principal on the Lancastrian side, arrived here by shipping, disguised himself with some of his followers in pilgrims' habits, therethrough got entrance, mastered the garrison, and seized the place, which thus politely won he has valiantly kept, and kept a long time defended against the king's power, until reasonable conditions swayed him to a surrender. Now, that's the occasion when Sir John Arundel of Trerice was killed in fighting on the sands beneath the mount. Ultimately, the mount had to surrender, and then I think that the Earl of Oxford was taken prisoner and then ultimately escaped when he was imprisoned in France, and he really became the leading commander for Henry VII at Bosworth, so he really lived to see a better day. Well, the next thing that happened, not many years afterwards, there was a great rising in Cornwall, the 1497 rebellion of the Cornish, when Perkin Warbeck arrived in this country pretending to be one of the Yorkist princes who'd been murdered by their uncle, Richard III, in the Tower. There's no doubt about that, in spite of all the nonsense that people talk. Richard III, he turned the stomach of the whole country, you see, against him, and that was how he lost at Bosworth. I mean, his own forces wouldn't really fight for him. And in any case, most of the Cornish gentry and the Devonshire, the West Country gentry, were nearly all of them on the Lancastrian side, because they were the real royal house. Well, Perkin Warbeck, when he landed at Whitsand Bay, not the one near Plymouth, but the one near Cape Cornwall, near Land's End, he left his Scottish wife, an aristocratic lady, the Lady Catherine Gordon, for safety and protection in St Michael's Mount, and then he went on. Well then, the next time in my period, the 16th century, when the Mount comes into history, it's described by Carew during the Prayer Book Rebellion, when the West Country people, both in Devon and Cornwall, entered into rebellion against the imposition of the Prayer Book in English, when they had been used to the Latin Mass. And this is what Carew tells us. During the last Cornish commotion, that's what he always calls it, divers gentlemen with their wives and families fled to the protection of this place, where the rebels besieged them. First winning the plain at the hill's foot by assault when the water was out. They crossed over the causeway, and then the even ground on the top by carrying up great trusses of hay before them to blench the defendants' sight and deaden their shot. After which they could make but slender resistance, For no sooner should anyone within peep out his head over those in-flanked walls, but he became an open mark to a whole shower of arrows. This disadvantage, together with the women's dismay and decrease of victuals, forced a surrender to those rakehel's mercy, who, nothing guilty of that effeminate virtue, spoiled their goods, imprisoned their bodies, and were rather by God's gracious providence than any want of will, purpose, or attempt, restrained from murdering the principal persons. So that's another exciting episode in the history of the Mount, isn't it? It's perfectly true that in West Cornwall they spoke mainly Cornish, and they went on speaking Cornish even in mid-Cornwall into the Elizabethan age, but Archbishop Cranmer had a very good debating point when he replied to them all and said, "How many of you Cornish folk understand Latin anyway?" "You understand English better than Latin," was the point that he made. Well, I think the real argument, they were defeated in the field outside Exeter. Whenever I go across that little bridge, you know, at Clyst, I always think, well, this was the end of the Cornish rebellion in 1549. So it's nice to think that the Mount was really involved in that.
And there were other battles to be fought. In 1513, Marazion was attacked by 30 French ships of war. In 1640, men, women and children, totaling 60 in number, were taken away by Turkish pirates. Guns and ammunition were supplied to the Mount from the Tower of London, and instructions were given that a flag was to be flown in the King's name, so that today the Union Jack flies from the church tower by royal command. All ships were required to strike their topsails in acknowledgement that they were subject to the commander-in-chief of the castle. The next commotion, to use Richard Carew's turn of phrase, in Elizabeth I's reign, was caused by the Spanish Armada.
Of course, there were threats, you know, of 2 more armadas, in addition to the Spanish Armada that actually came up the coast, and must have been a splendid sight, don't you think, from the Mount. I've read the actual letters reporting the fishermen off the Lizard, who were the first people to catch sight of the Spanish Armada. It's awfully exciting.
And that was on Helzeffron Cliffs.
Yes. Well, the Mount itself, by this time, the important people had become the secular governor, and there was a family called Harris, who naturally were made governors of the Mount because they lived in that house just across the way, Carnegie. And then there was a family at Clowance called St. Aubin, and they were very much interested in the Mount too, the local landed gentry. But a curious thing that happened at the end of Queen Elizabeth's reign, I've never been able quite to understand it, but the greatest of English families, the Cecils, the great Robert Cecil, who was the leading minister and became the Earl of Salisbury, he bought it, and all the lands round about. I can't quite think why it was that he wanted it, but the result of that is, you know, that the cartulary of St. Michael's Mount is at Hatfield House. I hope somebody will edit it one day. And the Cecils held on to it for 2 generations. They sold it just before the Civil War. When the Mount was sold, with all the lands around it, it was sold to the family of Bassett, who belonged to Cotehele. Of course, most people have the idea that Cornwall was wholly for the king, wholly royalist. But that, as I think I pointed out with regard to Lanhydrock, isn't wholly true. Most of the Cornish were for the king, and most of the famous families were really royalist. But there was a very considerable party on the side of Parliament. The St. Aubins were, and of course the great Lord Robarts was the leader. But Francis Bassett became the governor and the owner. And Francis Bassett was a convinced royalist who spent practically the whole of his fortune in supporting the royal cause. When the Civil War broke out, he bought guns, he financed out of his own pocket, first of all, 12 soldiers on the king's side, and later on he financed 50 soldiers. It practically ruined him. He built a gate going upwards on the plain. He built a watch house. He built also 2 gun posts to protect the harbour, and also gun posts of which you can see the remains, at the very top when you get to the top of the mount as a modern pilgrim. Well, he was such a very convinced royalist that at the first big royalist victory, Sir Francis Bassett wrote a famous letter, which I should like to quote to you. It's so enthusiastic, shows him in love with his wife. "Dearest soul, O dear soul, praise God everlastingly. Read the enclosed, ring out the bells, raise bonfires, publish these joyful tidings. Believe these truths, excuse my writing larger, I have no time. We march on to meet of victorious friends, and to seize all the rebels left if we can find such living. Your duteous prayers God has heard. Bless us accordingly, pray everlastingly, and Jane and Betty and all you own, thy own Francis Bassett. Pray let my cousin Harry know these joyful blessings. Send word to the ports, south and north, to search narrowly for all strangers travelling for passage, and cause the keeping them close and safe. To my dearest, dearest friend, Mistress Bassett at the Mount. Speed this, haste, haste." Isn't that nice, Ted? It shows, of course, great enthusiasm, because he was a great royalist, and he was fighting in the field at Stratton, and he's writing to his wife, and he's left the Mount in her care. Well, as I said to you, he spent so much money on the royalist cause, paying the soldiers out of his own pocket and providing the guns and the gun posts and so forth, that he was forced to sell at the end of it all. And he sold the Mount to Colonel John St Aubyn, who'd been on the other side. That's how the St Aubyns got it. They were parliamentarians, and because they were on the side of Parliament, they came out on top. And they didn't lose all their money in the way that Francis Bassett did. He was forced to sell. Well, now the St Aubyns were a very, very old family who came into Cornwall originally from Devon, but we find them fixed at Clowance by the reign of Edward III, sheriffs of Cornwall and all that kind of thing. And they remain at the Mount for the remainder of the 17th century and then into the 18th century, until you come to a very interesting figure, the 3rd baronet. They get a baronetcy, and that Sir John St Aubyn is rather famous. There are portraits of him at the Mount and also at Pencarrow, which is their other place where the Molesworth St Aubyns live, because the famous Prime Minister Sir Robert Walpole said that everybody has his price except the little Cornish baronet, so he wasn't going to be bought. This really refers to all the boroughmongers who had boroughs in their pockets. And of course, they were a bit of property. One doesn't need to be sort of very progressive or left-wing about pocket boroughs, because a small handful of voters there were only too pleased to be able, the only chance they had to make £10 or £20 for their vote. And I don't suppose for a moment that they liked it when they were reformed out of existence. Well, that was the 3rd baronet. Well, we come later on to the 5th baronet, who is a very interesting character indeed, very much the ancestor of the present family. He was a highly intelligent man, he was fellow of the Royal Society of Antiquaries, and he was a patron of the arts and a connoisseur and all that. But one of the things that's curious about him is that though he had an enormous family of children, he omitted to marry until towards the end of his life. And there's a portrait of the lady who lived there and sat at the head of his table. She was a most awfully nice woman called Juliana Villicum. And I think she was so nice that when the baronets proposed to marry her halfway on, she said, well, that wouldn't be fair on the older children, and it wouldn't be indeed. So therefore all these children, you see, didn't have the benefit of marriage, but they continued the St Aubyn name all right. And the books tell us that Sir John St Aubyn, who by this time was a very, very rich man, was able to give every one of 13 of these children a handsome dowry of 10,000 each, which amounted to 130,000. How did he manage to raise all that? Well, not from the Mount. I'll tell you how. An ancestor of his had the good luck to buy Devonport. Devonport was then called Plymouth Dock, and he bought it when it brought in about 2,500 a year. But this Sir John St Aubyn was making 15,000 a year out of it. Well, you multiply that for contemporary value by 20, and you can see what a rich man he was. And he was not only a patron of a large family, but he was also a patron of the arts. He's the person who employed Opie to paint quite a number of the pictures that still remain at the Mount. Now, let me give you just a brief description of him, because it comes into a very famous book by a Cornishman. You know that the Cornishman Edward John Trelawney, who belonged to the family of another beautiful Cornish house called Trewithen. His mother was really one of the Hawkinses of Trewithen. In his recollections of Shelley and Byron, he points out that he, as a Cornishman, was invited to dinner by Sir John St Aubyn, who was living abroad for 3 years on the banks of Lake Geneva. In the largest country house there, Plangeau, near Geneva, lived a friend, a Cornish baronet, a good specimen of the old school, well read and polished by long intercourse with intelligent men of many nations. He retained a custom of the old barons now obsolete. His dining hall was open to all his friends. You were welcomed at his table as often as it suited you to go there without the ceremony of inconvenient invitations. Well, this is Sir John St Aubyn. When he died, he was given the most prodigious funeral. But meanwhile, you find him encouraging the arts. He was a great patron of Opie, who painted one of the portraits of Sir John. There are several of him. There's one of him with his favourite hound and holding his hat and cane at St Michael's Mount. Also in one of the drawing rooms in the Mount, there's a rather beautiful Opie of the Mount itself by moonlight. That was rather the fashion then. There's also the famous portrait of Dolly Pentraeth, the old fisherwoman who was supposed to have been the last person who spoke Cornish. These are early Opie portraits because it was very good of Sir John to be a patron of a young, unknown painter and giving him his start in life. Well, then there were other painters too. There's the well-known Benjamin Farrington, and he came down and he got fishermen to take him out in a boat in order that he could do a painting of the Mount on the side, which we don't usually see. It's said, you know, that the Mount is most beautiful from the sea side. So let us just look for a moment at what he says. Well, now, this is the year 1810. While the Napoleonic War is still going on, and Benjamin Farrington comes down to Cornwall, and on September the 8th, before breakfast, I made a finished sketch of St Michael's Mount from the Star Inn, that was at Marazion. I next hired a boat with 2 fishermen to take me round the island, which they undertook to do, and to allow me time for making sketches for a reward of 4 shillings. The weather was very fine, and the sea sufficiently smooth to enable them to keep the boat nearly stationary wherever I chose to remain. This rock with its castle is a noble subject for a painter, and then he goes on to describe it. I passed a considerable time in contemplating the island from various points and in sketching it, and my boatmen being satisfied with the bargain they had made and being young and cheerful, they sung while I pursued my purpose.
Well, Benjamin Farrington was clearly impressed with his first sight of St Michael's Mount. Lady St Levan has her own recollections.
When I first came here and got out of the night sleeper, I thought it looked like a ghostly birthday cake. It was rising out of the mist in the morning. But my father-in-law said nobody had ever described it like that before. It's been a tremendous experience and very, very interesting. It's, of course, like being back at kindergarten from September to May. You have to be back in Marazion for the last boat at 20 to 5. I once drove from London to Marazion in 5 hours in order to catch the last boat, and I don't want to repeat it.
Do you look upon it as an eerie place?
No, not at all. No, no ghostly signs. Somebody I know went into the blue drawing rooms one day and said, "Oh, I know there's a bad feeling here. My temperature went down as I came in." Well, of course, because there's not much heating there. The business of actually deciding when to put the central heating boilers on is a difficult one, but you go as long as you can, and then you suddenly decide we've got to go on. Then, of course, you keep them on until about June. And we have a massive number of dishcloths that we put along the bottoms of the windows when the storms are blowing. And also when the Land Rover drives up the hill, if somebody's left the front door open, the exhaust of the Land Rover goes right through the castle.
How many rooms do you normally occupy?
I would say 4. Our snuggery, where we are now, I have one office and another room with a photocopier in it. My husband has 2 offices, stacked with files. But there are 200 stone stairs that have to be scrubbed.
How often is that done?
Twice a year. Not too bad.
How do you react to people wandering around your house, guided tours and that sort of thing? Does that put you off at all?
Well, no, because it's part of the history of the place when you think of the pilgrims always coming here. So it is no problem. And because we live in the Victorian wing, they only come into our part by arrangement.
Which part of the castle do you think is most in danger and is in most need, perhaps, of repair?
Difficult one to answer, because we're trying to get round all that is needed year by year. I think the last one was the church tower, which had to be repointed, but mercifully it caused no damage in the church when the water came through, because it was over the centre of the church, so it wasn't falling over any of the church furnishings. But we're dealing with that now.
The church dominates the island, and most of the massive masonry beneath the later alterations is that of the original church, built in King Stephen's reign. Although I doubt, at that time, if the tower carried a ring of bells to summon the pilgrims to worship.
Well, at the Mount, you know, they've got a ring of bells, and 3 of them go right back to the Middle Ages, and they have the medieval inscription on one of them, St. Nicholas, because St. Nicholas was the patron saint of all mariners and sailors. Well, I think they've got a peal of 6 at the Mount, and it must be simply lovely to hear them. I love the Cornish bells, you know. We've got a very fine ring of bells here, and the bells of Truro Cathedral, they've got 10 or 12 there. Now, I've never heard the bells of the Mount ringing. I'd love to hear that, ringing out over the sea. It would be heartbreakingly beautiful, wouldn't it?
The small harbour is the first point of contact for anyone visiting St Michael's Mount. Today, the island's economy depends on tourism, whereas at one time the picturesque harbour was a very busy working port, particularly at the beginning of the last century, as author and local historian Clive Carter told me.
Oh yes, it was extremely busy. There was a small shipyard there, round about the period of Napoleonic times. We go back to about, say, 1802, 1810, dates like that, We find from the port records at Penzance little small cutters, sloops, and skiffs being actually launched in the Mount Harbour for Marazion owners or people living on the Mount. Little traders that plied from the Mount around to Penzance occasionally, or even went farther, Falmouth and around to the Helford, or even up along the north coast of Padstow. It's a very handy little harbour. It's not particularly safe. It depends on the quarter the wind is blowing. If the wind blows southeasterly, cutting right into the bay, it's a handy place to come in and lie up, because you are relatively sheltered there. The harbour itself more or less declined after Penzance became a full-scale port, because, as you appreciate, it's far easier to unload straight onto a quay, into a cart, and take it to its destination, rather than unloading and having to wait for the tide to go out to expose the causeway. They also rebuilt and refurbished a couple of small French ships that had been taken as war prizes during the Napoleonic times, and were then bought by local families. The Jagos, who lived on the Mount for a long time, they were very famous sea captains. I think the last generation of them commanded the old Harvey brigantine, the Henry Harvey from Hale. But there was a lot of trade in here for the benefit of the mines behind Marazion, like Wheal Neptune, Gwallan, various small copper and tin mines here. They would bring in the Baltic barks. These were ships that came from the Baltic loaded with timber for the mines. They had rather big ports cut in their bows, rather like trapdoors. And once they were alongside, you could pull out the trapdoor and you pull the enormously long bolts out through the bows, drop them in the sea and make up rafts, and they would then be poled ashore on the high tide. They were quite a popular sight, these Baltic barks. I think one or two of the crew actually married locally. But this little corner here saw some quite exciting and alarming times. It was a very handy spot if you wanted to get anything in after dark. And the captains of the revenue cutters knew this, and on numerous occasions they would beach their cutters up close to the Mount on the sands here, or send in a longboat's crew when they got a suspicion that something was happening. And I think there was one time they sent a longboat's crew in, and a Mount man or a Marazion man was sighted pushing his barrel along the beach. I think it was quite innocent. I think he'd probably bought it off a French chasse-maree that happened to have one kicking around on board or something. And anyway, they sort of said, "Oh, are you?" And he probably rolled his barrel faster and faster until eventually he had to abandon it and ran for his life across the sands with the naval men splashing in the shallows after him, shouting to him to come back, which of course no self-respecting Cornishman would do. They had one case of a ship that came in here, loaded up with, I think, raisins and wine and fruit. Incredible delicacies that the ordinary Cornishmen in those days probably didn't even know what they were. And all the locals swarmed out, ready to jump on board and have a free feast. And in that instant, the Penwith yeomanry, which I get the impression was rather thick farmers' sons who waved swords at everybody and got their cart horse out, came thundering along the beach, hallooing and shouting at them. And there was another chase with the would-be wreckers running for their lives along the beach, pursued by the cavalry. But the Mount itself was quite a defence for the bay around here. French privateers used to come up into this bay during the naval wars against France, quite boldly and quite openly, because the Royal Navy was spread a bit thin, and it was not unknown for a heavily rigged armed Frenchman from Dunkirk and Saint-Malo would come up here cruising, looking for ships to capture. And the result of this, there was a large battery established on the Mount to more or less defend the little harbour here, to stop the Frenchmen coming in. There are numerous accounts in the bay of fights taking place close to the Mount. Quite often, a little convoy of ships would assemble here under a naval guard ship, and they'd collect together all the little traders that were bound for London, Falmouth, farther up Channel, and the little flock of them would all anchor around here behind the Mount with a naval brig of war as a guard ship. It was a convoy system that we adopted in 1916 and adopted throughout the last war. We began doing the convoy system, and this little area here was a sort of convoy marshalling part, and the naval brig would lie off and watch her flock, and quite often a Frenchman would sneak up from Cudden or across from Mosul and try and cut somebody out of the convoy as a prize. But usually with the naval ships, the naval escort, and also the guns of the Mount, they would keep the Frenchmen at bay. But there were numerous occasions when we had more or less little mini sea fights very close to the mount indeed. You know, the overs from the sea fight probably landed on the beach here. If a fleet got in here and it was perhaps windbound, a crew would come ashore to buy provisions, collect water from a local parish pump. They got a bit short. Fancy to stretch their legs and walk along the beach or visit the local ale houses. It was quite a coming and going here. Looking at these sort of empty beach today, we can't really envisage what a busy, thriving port that the Mount was, and Marazion itself. Even though Marazion hasn't got a harbour, it was a very busy, lively port, amazing little port. Unfortunately, a lot of the original town is long gone now, particularly during Victorian times, but we had a Coast Guard station here. There was a small shipyard on the beach here. There's even a small steamer launched here in about, I think, 1871 or 2. A small wooden steamer was erected on the beach here. They got an engine, I think, from Harvey at Hale, popped it into it, and away the little thing went. Unfortunately, we don't know a great deal about her, but I suspect she may be in a little steam fishing boat to help tow the seine boats and the other fishing boats around.
In my period, the Elizabethan age, the great Sir John Hawkins, who was responsible for the great slaving voyages in the West Indies, not that he was the first person to go in for slaving, it was a regular trade, but in his third voyage was overthrown by the Spaniards. Francis Drake, this is his first appearance in history. Francis Drake was the only commander of a little ship to escape. My goodness, he got his own back in later years. John Hawkins, in the bigger ship, came back with scores of his men dead and starving, couldn't get any further than the little harbour, and he came in there in the Million. The crew was so exhausted, there were only about a dozen men left. They couldn't work the ship back to Plymouth, so he wrote up to his brother in Plymouth, who dispatched a ship to come down and work the ship really back home. That was in 1569, in the reign of Elizabeth. Well, now, there's a further most important literary memory of the Mount, which not very many people know about. Sir Walter Raleigh was a great friend of the leading Elizabethan poet Spenser, and they came back to Ireland together, rounding Cape Cornwall, and of course they landed in the harbour at the Mount. And this appears in one of the poems of the famous poet Spenser, Colin Clout's Come Home Again. There did a lofty mount at first us greet, which did a stately heap of stones uprear, that seemed amid the surges for to fleet, much greater than that frame which did us bear. There did our ship her fruitful womb unlaid, and put us all ashore on Cynthia's land. Edmund Spenser was bringing the manuscript of one of the most famous poems in English history, The Faerie Queen. And he landed there with Sir Walter Raleigh. Then they went by land up to the court. And the Mount is again mentioned in Spenser's Shepherd's Calendar. Later on it's mentioned, I think in Paradise Lost, in two very famous lines of the poet Milton, the great vision of the guarded mount that looks towards Namancos and Bayona's hold. So it's always been famous.
The last occasion the Mount had to be garrisoned was during the Second World War, as the Dowager, Lady St Levan, told me.
We had soldiers at the bottom, and we had barbed wire all round the Mount. And one morning, when peace had been declared, I woke to hear some voices singing Italian songs, and I was bewildered. And I looked out of a window and realized that some of the prisoners of war, the Italians, who were going to return in due course, were cutting away the wire, and that we should no longer be wired in. Rumour had it, of course, that the Germans wanted it for Ribbentrop, and that's why we weren't bombed. But we were. We had our electrical installation at the bottom bombed.
Did you ever entertain royalty?
Yes, on several occasions. We had the Queen Mother to luncheon only. We had 3 or 4 royalties staying in the house. I used to inquire if there was anything they didn't like, because I know nothing more awful than when you go to a public dinner and you have to eat something that you know you're going to pay for next day. And they always were down for some reason or other, so that we had the time by tides and whatever they had to do. But they were so kind and they so enjoyed it. They liked the island life.
Were you ever frightened on the island?
No, you know, that's an extraordinary thing, never. And it isn't that I'm a brave person, nor that I don't always see the gloomy side of things. But there's a certain peace and strength and quiet and continuity that I think seeped through to one. One was anxious if people were out in a boat or at sea and didn't come back. At the time you thought that they should. But that isn't quite the same. The danger to yourself or on the island, no, except the case of illness. Illness I used to dread that somebody wouldn't get ashore or the doctor couldn't get over. It never occurred. And I was there from 1940 to 1975. The other thing that was a worry to us was if there was a fire, there was no question of getting a fire engine over. And so that we had to have a well-trained staff on the island and in the castle to do the best. And we should have had firemen, but not necessarily a fire engine.
No visit to the island is complete unless you undertake the climb to the top of the hill for a tour of the castle. And there's a very good chance that you'll be shown around by Lord St Levan.
This is the inner sitting room. It's known as Sir John's room because you can see the portrait of the 5th Baronet here. He was a great connoisseur of art, great collector of works of art, and he was a member of Parliament, and he was a friend of Shelley and Keats and people like that. And he must have been of immense charm. He had 11 illegitimate children by his second mistress. He had one previous mistress, he had 2 children by. And he used to come up to this room in the evening and light his candle. And his first mistress, who was pensioned off and lived in Gulville, the village over there, it is said, used to look towards the mount to see the lighted candle. His grandfather, the portrait of the 3rd Baronet over there, married that girl who was the Devonport heiress. And the elder daughter was married, and her dowry consisted of all the family jewels. There was nothing left except what was considered to be in those days rather a poor farm, but on that land Devonport was subsequently built. But when he married her, she arrived with a cartload of half-crowns, which was brought down to Clarence, the family home.
This is a very cosy room, isn't it?
My father loved it. He came in this room a great deal and used it a lot. I don't, because it's open to the public, so I can't keep anything. Yeah.
The ceiling actually is quite steep, sloping as beams, of course. Yes. Grandfather clock there in the corner.
And there's lovely miniatures. And there's a miniature there of King Charles I, which was given to his general in Cornwall, the great Bevel Grenville. And it's rather interesting portrait of King Charles I, because it shows him as he really must have looked like towards the end of the Civil War when things weren't going too well for him.
I'm surprised that when King Charles II eventually came to the throne, and because the St Albans were parliamentarians, that he didn't really take the castle away from you.
Well, I've only just discovered there was quite a fight over that, because Colonel Bennett, who was the garrison commander at the time, was obviously not in favour of restoring Charles II. He was I suppose what you might call the left wing of the Commonwealth Party, and there must have been a bit of a battle. But I've got a letter in the castle from General Monk handing over the castle to Colonel John Snorpin, and that's the original title deed of the family.
Well, from Sir John's room we go now.
We go now into a passageway. This is where we really try to bore the public a little bit, because it's a very narrow passageway, and if we have 2,000 people in one day trying to get through this passageway, we try and push them through, and this is where we have contemporary portraits of the family. From the passageway, this, to me, is my favourite room in the whole castle. It originally would have been the High Priest's room. It had been taller and wider, and as you can see, it was decorated in probably about 1805. So it's a marvellous early Regency room. It's a library. See the lovely books and rather charming furniture. There's a gaming table, 18th century gaming table there. In the middle there is a very good gardening library. My father was a very keen gardener, and when I'm asked complicated questions about the garden, I would have to come up here and consult the book.
Well, this room now leads off to this magnificent hall that we've got here.
Yes.
We go down some steps into this one.
This is the famous Chevy Chase room because of this hunting frieze. You've seen the hunting frieze at Lanhydrock. The craftsman must have been about the same time. Probably the date on the coat of arms, 1641. He had rather sense of humour. You can see a man shooting at a rabbit from very close range on that side. And the one I always very much like is a bull with a picador blowing a horn and a man trying to spear the bull. And just in case the bull won the fight, you can see the two men with guns to cover him. But the most interesting one is an ostrich. You can see a man rather unkindly sticking a spear into the back side of the ostrich. And the ostrich has got a horseshoe in its mouth. I don't know whether the artist was wishing the ostrich luck, or whether it may be Lord Digby came here the other day, and he said that the ostrich was the family crest of the Digby family, with a horseshoe in its mouth. And that went back to a battle between the Romans and the Africans. There's an African prince called Jugurtha who rebelled against Rome. And there was a tremendous fight between the Romans riding horses and the Africans riding ostriches.
Who won them?
I think the Africans did on that occasion because the ostriches were rather quicker.
Hanging on the wall here, we've got suits of armour. Where do these come from?
These were dug up outside the main wall of the castle on the west side. They're Cromwellian armour, the people who died attacking St. Michael's Mount. They've been here for a very long time. They were shown to be in this room in an 1812 print.
That slight rumbling that we can hear in the background, is that the wind whistling around the battlements?
Yes, this is completely exposed to the Atlantic. You can see it's blowing quite strong today, and we've always had a terribly difficult time to keep the salt sea water coming in on the freeze.
Well, now we've moved into another smaller room again.
This is the smoking room. When the Chevy Chase room was used as a dining room, the gentlemen used to come in here after dinner and smoke their cigars and drink their port and send the ladies through that door down to the drawing room. I remember it very well when I came here before the war. Above is a little room where King Charles II was hidden at the end of the Civil War when the Parliamentary Army under General Fairfax was advancing. He was hidden here for a night before he escaped the Scilly Isles and then to France. There's a tiny little passage and turret above here.
Well, we move from here.
This is the map room.
And the maps around the room here of Cornwall at different periods in time. And I think you've got a map here, haven't you, of the giants of Cornwall?
Yes, over here you can see William Howe's map of Devon and Cornwall. You can see it was dated 1612, and you can see the giant sitting on top of the hill, so that the children must have been told the story of the giant of St. Michael's Mount over 300 years ago.
Jack the Giant Killer.
Jack the Giant Killer.
This is where the legend, the story is based. It's on St. Michael's Mount, and that giant, I think, was called Cormoran, was it?
That's right, and of course all Cornish boys were called Jack, Cousin Jack, so that's how the story started. And I also very much like this map here, which is John Ogleby. It's a road map from Exeter to Cornwall. And you can see the road ended in those days at St. Michael's Mount, because this was the great place of pilgrimage. And also, if you lived in Penzance, you had to come to Marizan to collect your mail. The mail coach ended here. In those days, they were more interested in the hills than anything else, because that's what tired the horses. So that you can see the map showing the hills all the way from Exeter to St. Michael's Mount.
How about the legends attached to the mount? Would there have been a giant living here, do you think?
Well, I think probably he was a robber. Probably he was a great big chap, and the Cornish were always rather smaller in stature, and that may have been the story. He probably did wade ashore and steal their sheep and cattle.
And the legend, of course, of Tristan and Isolde, with Ogrin, I think, supposed to have come to St. Michael's Mount to have bought material for Isolde.
Yes, of course, St. Michael's Mount was a great trading port. The Irish came across the Hale estuary, and traded gold. And that's why when Isolde's wedding dress was bought, the hermit Ogrin sent to St Michael's Mount to buy it here. And all the stories of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table centred on St Michael's Mount, and also the story of the sea flood, and Trevelyan and the Vivians of Trelawarren had faster horses than anybody else, and they were able to escape the sea flood by riding their horses.
And that would have been riding out of Lyonesse.
The lost land of Lyonesse, which is all around you, between here and the St.Ives. But of course all the stories got wonderfully mixed up in the Middle Ages, that they had combined all the old legends and stories and King Arthur, and then some of them would have applied to Brittany and some of them to Cornwall. And nobody quite knows when the sea flood was, and I think people now think it was probably about 1750 BC.
And this beautiful model, this is made of cork, is it?
Yes, it's a model of the mount made entirely out of champagne corks by Henry Lee, who was the butler here just before the last World War. And the family drank champagne every night for their dinner. And my great-uncle didn't like the sound of the popping of champagne corks, so it was all uncorked in the butler's pantry. It was beautifully done, and he did it with a penknife. And it's absolutely 100% accurate. I remember him. He was an old man with a white beard. He died in about 1939.
But it's in such great detail, isn't it?
Enormous detail. But you can imagine he didn't have much to do in the evenings in the winter.
Other people who contributed to it must have had a pretty good time themselves, actually drinking the champagne so that the next cork could come out.
Yes, I think they did themselves very well in those days.
Now, where have we got to now? This is the blue drawing room, is it?
Yes, it's very confusing because the building was originally the Lady Chapel, and the Lady Chapel was built at the end of the 15th century when William of Worcester came here in 1478. He described the Lady Chapel as newly built. And of course, after the Protestant Reformation, it wasn't used as a Lady Chapel anymore. And in 1750, it was converted into these two beautiful blue drawing rooms, which we see now.
But walking into this room, you certainly do get the feeling of the period, don't you?
Absolutely. It is this early Rococo Gothic plasterwork. It's early Strawberry Hill. And as far as I know, Horace Walpole would have been a friend of the third baronet, who was a member of Parliament. In fact, he was the official leader of the opposition against Walpole, who was then the Prime Minister. And I think that probably Horace Walpole influenced this. You can see this lovely Chippendale furniture here, Chinese Chippendale. And these two portraits here are rather nice because John St Aubyn was a great friend of Francis Bassett, Lord of Dunstanville. And of course they couldn't take photographs of each other, so they exchanged portraits. And the Bassett family were very generous. They gave us a Gainsborough over there, lovely Gainsborough. And we gave them a portrait by Sir Joshua Reynolds. And we got Opie to copy the Reynolds portrait. And there's an Opie copy of the original Reynolds portrait, which I believe the Bassett family still have.
How do you look upon the National Trust and their contribution to St Michael's Mount?
Well, my father gave St Michael's Mount to the National Trust in 1954. Because he very much admired the experience and knowledge of the members of the committee and the staff of the National Trust at the time. There were no financial reasons to give St Michael's Mount away, but he thought that was the best solution for generations ahead. And ever since 1954, it's been a great success. The National Trust, of course, have great experts in conservation of works of art. And so we've enjoyed our partnership with the Trust very much. My father didn't give the whole of St Michael's Mount away as the National Trust. They very kindly gave us a lease of the Victorian wing for 1,000 years. So that'll be a long time ahead. But as long as there's a male member of the St Albans family for 1,000 years, I hope the family will go on living here. And my father didn't give away the terrace gardens because he loves them so much, so he kept those. And some of the houses in the village he kept back.
Do you think perhaps that after 1,000 years there might be a renewal of the lease?
Well, I don't know, it's a long time ahead. It's almost as far ahead as going back to William the Conqueror. I don't think I'll foresee what will happen in 1,000 years' time.
Well, the mount has been in the possession of the St Albans since 1659. Other families who have long connections with the island include the Berts, the Urins, the Jagos and the Matthewses. Now take John Matthews, for example. In his time, he's been head boatman, postmaster, fire officer, church warden, just a few of the offices that he's held. A typical situation on the Mount where you have to be able to turn your hand to anything. Oh, and another thing John told me. The islanders have a nickname.
A Mount Maggot, commonly known as Mount Maggots. It's Merzine Crows, and we're Mount Maggots, sure say. So Maritime people used to feed off us. Going to school, you had to learn to row before you could write. That was the main thing. You had to row. And often, we going to school in the wintertime, and they had a nice fire. Well, you would jump in a puddle of water and get really wet and go up and say, "Teacher, we got wet coming over in the boat," and sit beside the fire. We had a nice fire and doing our lessons while the others were shivering up the other end of the classroom. But the only trouble was, you had to go over when the mailboat went. My father was the mailman, postman, and we had to go at that hour, early hour, between 7 and 8:30 and row. And then when you come to go home, the weather was rough. You had to wait sometimes till 10 and 10:30 at night. Well, the only place we had for a bit of warmth was in the blacksmith shop. And then when we got home, we was well and truly black. And then we cupped another iron to have a bath before we went to bed. And then up next morning and off again, you go through the same drill. But as you see, it never hurt me. When you got older and got out into the world, well, it was a picnic. The rest of the world, you were so used to it.
Well, living on the Mount certainly creates its own problems. Another example, the simple task of moving furniture.
It is a great problem, and we had a problem when I bought a refectory table for the trebuchet room to replace the rather ugly Victorian table that was in the room before. And I told the dealer who sold me the table that I wouldn't pay him until he got the table up the hill and got it through very narrow doorways. He only just did it with about half an inch to spare. And once the table was in the trebuchet room, I wrote out the cheque, and I remember well it was for £4,000. And now I'm told the table's worth at least 12,000, so it was a good deal. Well, it's a lovely table. It's a genuine 1625 refectory table.
How do you manage, though, with something, say, as bulky as a grand piano?
Well, the grand piano had to be carried up here, which we have in what we call the music room. It's the Bluesner piano from Leipzig. I don't know how they got that up. It must have been a tremendous job.
One day we were sitting indoors having tea, thought we'd left work, and a knock come to the door, and they said, "We want you to help to take a piano up to the drawing room." And of course, from the lodge gates now, we had to manhandle this grand piano right up to the castle.
George Matthews, a fourth-generation islander who worked 50 years for the estate, 10 of those as head gardener, and on occasions, it seems, as furniture remover.
They had a little small flat trolley with wheels on it, which helped push and shove and drag it with ropes. And when they got up to the east door, they took the legs off, and then we took it up on its side and put the legs on again when they got it up there.
But when you got up to the castle, surely you had to carry it up several floors.
We had to carry it up all those steps. There's 100 steps exactly. They're granite steps. There's a spiral staircase. And went up there on each side. Of course, there was 8 or 9 of us there doing of it.
Must have been a lot of clanging and banging and twanging, I would have thought.
Yes, and a lot of swearing.
It was on the island as well that John Matthews met his wife Doris when, as a young girl, she came to work for the St Levan family.
I was second kitchen maid, and the little scullery maid we had, she couldn't even lift the pots and pans, some of them. They were copper, you know, steel lined and all this. Everything was made, jellies, creams, everything, and we had the mortar for pounding up the stuff, and all the bread was made, the cakes, everything. The kitchens then were marvellous, and all the lovely coppers, you know. It was hard work, but everything was really lovely. And when the yacht summertime and the families were down, you know, there was 3 nurseries, and of course there was footmen, housemaids, 5 housemaids, housekeeper. There was 5 in the kitchen. You know, it was really something.
Was it a difficult place to keep clean, the Mount? Because when you say you look at it today, it's a huge building, isn't it?
Yeah, well, of course they had so many housemaids. You see, they had 5 housemaids and a head maid, and then the housekeeper. No, they all had their own work to do, the same as we in the kitchen. You had to scrub the kitchen twice a day, and it was coal fires. And, you know, the bread making, well, that was set going the night before. We were lucky if we got to bed 12 o'clock and we was up again 5:30 to get things done, you know. But, well, it was hard going, but we enjoyed it. We didn't know anything else those days. And really our life was all around our work. And I had, Sunday mornings, I had to go to church. You had to go there. Well, one Sunday morning, John rang the bells and he said, we made arrangements, we were going out after, I wasn't going to church. So we were going out and sit on the Mount. It was lovely. And of course the next morning I was on the carpet because I wasn't in the choir. His lordship sent for me. And of course he knew John was missing, so he knew that we was out.
That maggot bites hard over on that island. Whether it's as salty or no, I don't know. But in talking about the kitchens, the fuel was coal. It was 400 weight of coal a day going in there, and then the spit, you toast the meat and all that around. It was really a wonderful kitchen.
And of
It was
course,
great.
those days, we didn't have meat cut up like they do today. We used to have the side of bacon and a sheep and a side of cow, bullock, or whatever you call it, and we had to cut that up. We had saws and all and joint it, you know, the cook. And I had kitchen maid and myself, we'd have to do all that and slice everything. And all the jellies were made. Nothing was bought at all those days. It set you up for life. It was the training for life.
Where exactly were the kitchens in the castle?
On the flat, that when you go in the back door, and the kitchen is where the museum is there now, well then 2 steps up and you're in the scullery, and next door used to be the pantry, the china larder, and then the next one was the slate slabs, that was the larder. There was no refrigeration then. It was all cold slabs and everything, and things to cover the meat, you know, and one cold room, and you'd hang things up there. But from the kitchen, through a long passage, then upstairs, a circular stair to the dining room. They were up above that, you know.
Very difficult for serving, I should think.
Oh, it was. No, I've known the young chap, odd man, go along with a tray, great big tray with stuff, oh, huge, great thing, and he'd run into things, you know, you heard things going. Oh, and we had one of the little scullery maid, everything ready, menus made out. The butler would write out his menus in French, great dining room full of people, and then the scullery maid would come down and take a saucepan she thought she put on to boil out because it had something burnt in it, tipped about a quart or more of clear soup down the drain just as it should have been going up. Everybody flying to get something in the soup line because everything had to be made, no bottom soups or anything like that. Everything had to be made. Luckily there was always a stock, you know, that you could rush it on. All the menus had to be altered and everything just for her throwing the soup down the drain at the last minute. I know once the cook was away and I had to do the cooking, and she said, His Lordship, not the late Lord, the old Lord, he liked rice creams, but he didn't like gelatine put in them. He liked them just with, you know, the rice and solid cream, and then it like that. And I couldn't get this to set, and I thought, right, a bit of gelatine, you're going to put this gelatine in. Oh gosh, I was up on the carpet. He didn't like that. But, you know, when they told you, that was it. There was no more about it. They were very, very good. Our life on the Mount was very good. I mean, there was lots of things, when I look back, was hard. You couldn't get off to anything. And we didn't have boats like today. Couldn't get off and do things like they can today. But we were happy enough because the money was so small. And you didn't have money to do anything. But we enjoyed it. What was it, 32 and 7 pence a week, wasn't it?
Then you do some fishing and catch
the
a few
crab
crabs
and
and
that.
lobsters and fish. And later years when we had allotment, potatoes, well, we self-maintained.
Yeah.
You didn't want to get anything from the mainland. So when you had the Lord's fresh air, well, what more did you want?
And of course I used to bottle all my fruit and make, you know, pickles and chutneys and things like that, and come over on the mainland at a farm and get 20 dozen eggs and pickle in, and 20 pounds of butter and salt that in. We was never short. We always had big store cupboards. And of course, I'm still the same now. I go on and on and on. John won't let me have a deep freeze. He said, no, we'll never get to the bottom of it. We never would, because I'm what you call a hoarder. And this year I'll vow, I said, I will not make any more chutneys. I go straight away and do it, don't I? Jams and everything.
But how about those smuggling activities that Clive Carter was telling us about? Did John have any recollections in that direction?
There was a cave at the south side, dug out, and there were shelves and all that there. Well, they used to sail from there to Brittany and bring brandy and silks over, but they never landed it in the harbour. But you could land at the south side, up between the rocks and up into the cave, and retrieve it at a later date. But no one didn't know, but there still was plenty of silk about. They used to bring the brandy over and mark it as you would a crab pot. Because if you were missing for several days, you knew that you were gone to Brittany, but you wouldn't come in with your cargo. So it had to go somewhere, so you would sink your barrels with markers beside your crab boats. And then a couple of days you go out and haul your crab boats, and then you bring your brandy in that.
Did you ever do that?
No, but I saw Mounts Bay turn red 3 times. First in 1908, when there was a raft of pilchards in the east side of the mount. It was a sight. And his company noticed the blood pit was that red. Now, 1938, I think it was, a ship went ashore on the Channel Islands loaded with barrels of wine. A month afterwards, after east wind and then southeast wind, lots of those barrels came into the bay. When we went out and we retrieved some of those, well, what could one do? It was 150 gallons in these barrels. What was it like? But that meant they were tapped, and we had some of it. We were in the old stick house there with bags up to the door and candles in corks stuck up and lit. There was a knock on the door, and the candles blown out, and we had 2 special policemen there in with this crowd, and I answered the door. "What are you doing here?" "I'm the customs." None other than my brother HOLMAN Leaf from the Navy, and he was the first man that had to drink out of the barrel. We had the right setting with the bags up to the window and the candles and the barrels and the aluminium dipper, which wasn't very nice drinking that, but it was quite cheery and bright. The only thing was that you're inclined to indulge a little too much.
Well, what did I do? It was around the Christmas, somewhere around Christmas time. And at that time, they would come over with provisions from Penzance. So the 2 chaps I'd known, and of course was waiting to give them a Christmas box, and I thought, oh, good. I did some of this wine, and I was recommended to put sugar and lemons and some of whatever drinks you got. So I put in some of everything of John's, brandy and whiskey and rum, and I don't know what all I put in it. And they had a tumbler each of this. They said, gosh, this is good. When they got over Marizine, I don't think it was all that good anyway. It made them drunk. It really made them drunk. And he comes in, and when I told him what? He said, you put in all that of my, what about my whiskey and my brandy and things? I said, all gone in. I said, a good lot of each. Well, I said, you've got a good lot here anyway.
She said, the 4 men brought your provisions, so what more do you want?
I didn't know. I had no idea what I was mixing, because I know nothing whatever about drinks.
They had no breathalyzers those days.
You know?
John Matthews was the last bowman of the St. Michael's Mount barge, because at one time a good deal of ceremony greeted important visitors. They were transported in the old family barge with the Mount boatman dressed in the family livery.
Well, that consists of a crochet shirt, a divided pleated skirt, light red waistcoat with numerous brass buttons, also a red coat and a 14-pound shield on the left arm, which was the St. Albans coat of arms. Of course, there was a big strain, but you put a bit of string around it and take the weight on your shoulder, so you never actually had it on your arm. And there was also 3 buttons, brass buttons, on the cuff.
Was the state barge on St. Michael's Mount, was it elaborately decorated?
Well, no, she was painted white with a red band about the second plank down from the top, and with a St. Albans coat of arms on the bow, port and starboard, and a coat of arms shield inboard across the transom.
And when would she have been used?
Oh, she was used on the state occasions, but the last time we used that was 1925. We didn't wear the state uniform. We wore just the jerseys with St. Michael's Mount and round hats. That was when Prince Chiki-Pu of Japan came over in 1925, and we took him from Chaparrock and landed him on the Queen's steps on the pier head, Eastern Pier.
think I should describe it as aloof and yet homely, which is a contradiction, beautiful and unpredictable, exciting yet very gentle. And I often go out and look at it and think, yes, that's the place that one wants to live in.
I don't think anybody would feel comfortable living in such a beautiful place like this and keeping it entirely to yourself. I think it's terribly important that we should share it with other people. And I don't think it's only the Levan family. I think what's so interesting about the Mount is the 6 famous Mount families that have been on the Mount for years. Everybody locally talks about St Michael's Mount as our Mount. And for the Cornish, it's the Cornish Mount. You know the Cornish anthem, about 20,000 Cornishmen will know the reason why, and St Michael's holds the London's Tower, and so on. St Michael's Mount is the Cornish national monument.